Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to your house engulfed in flames. Your wife, your daughters, trapped, smoke thickens, screams vanish. You escape with burns across your body, but you're the only one who makes it out alive. Now imagine being arrested for starting that fire. Imagine being told you murdered your family based on evidence that decades later, scientists would call completely false. This isn't fiction. This is the real story of David Gavitt, a man who spent nearly 27 years in prison for a crime that never happened. A victim of grief, loss, and junk science. This is more than just a story of a wrongful conviction. It's about how bad forensics can ruin lives, and how our legal system often clings to the past, even as science marches forward. The fire that changed everything was 1985 in Unia, Michigan. David Gavitt and his wife Angela lived in a modest home with their 2 young daughters. On a cold March night, a fire broke out in their living room. In a matter of minutes, flames spread through the house with terrifying speed. David was burned while trying to reach his family, but the smoke and heat became too overwhelming. He barely made it out alive. When firefighters arrived, the home was already consumed. The blaze took the lives of Angela and both daughters. David, covered in soot and scars, was devastated. But what began as a tragedy quickly turned into an investigation. Fire investigators combed through the rubble. They claimed to find signs of arson, pore patterns, on the floor that supposedly indicated a flammable liquid had been used to start the fire. Investigators pointed to crazed glass windows that had fractured in a pattern that, at the time, was believed to be associated with accelerants. The conclusion: someone had deliberately set the fire, and David, as the only survivor, became the prime suspect. Within months, he was arrested, charged with arson and murder, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He maintained his innocence from day one, but no one listened, because the science seemed settled. The rise and fall of fire science. In the 1980s, arson investigation was more art than science. Fire marshals and investigators relied on long-standing beliefs and visual cues. Cracked windows, blackened floors, burned patterns, even the color of smoke. These indicators were taught and passed down for generations, but they were never scientifically tested. One of the biggest culprits: pore patterns, uneven burns on a floor that were thought to signal where gasoline or another liquid had been poured. Investigators believed these patterns proved intent, and in case after case, they were used to convict people of arson. But in the 1990s and 2000s, researchers began running controlled experiments, and what they found shattered everything fire investigators thought they knew. Pore patterns can happen without accelerants. Crazed glass can form from heat, not chemicals. Flashover, an intense stage of fire, can mimic signs of arson. In fact, many so-called arson indicators were simply the natural result of a fire becoming too hot too fast. Scientists like Dr. Gerald Hurst and John Lentini, both world-renowned fire experts, started publishing papers, raising red flags about hundreds of potential wrongful convictions based on misinterpreted fire scenes. David Gavitt's case became a textbook example. But despite the science evolving, the courts remained stuck, because legal precedent doesn't automatically change with science. Guilty by default, David Gavitt sat in prison for over 2 decades. He missed every birthday, every holiday, every memory his daughters should have had. Behind bars, he carried the crushing grief of his family's death, paired with the weight of being labeled a murderer. He had no appeals left, no recourse, no hope, until everything changed in 2009. That year, the Michigan Innocence Clinic began reviewing his case. They brought in modern fire experts to re-examine the original investigation. What they found was horrifying. Every single piece of evidence that led to David's conviction was now considered invalid. The burn patterns, misinterpreted. The window cracks, natural. The accelerant traces, non-existent. And most critically, no sign of foul play. Experts concluded that the fire was likely accidental. Probably an electrical malfunction, a space heater, or faulty wiring, common causes of house fires, especially in older homes. In 2012, after nearly 27 years of wrongful imprisonment, David Gavitt was exonerated and released. He walked out of prison with nothing but the clothes on his back and a lifetime of pain behind his eyes. A system stuck in time. David's case isn't just about one man. It's a mirror held up to a system terrified of admitting it was wrong. Because here's the dark truth: our justice system values finality more than accuracy. Once a person is convicted, overturning that conviction is incredibly hard, even if new science proves they're innocent. Judges often say, well, that's how it was understood back then. But what if back then was based on lies? This is what legal experts call the backward-looking bias. Court decisions are bound by precedent, not by updated facts. So when science evolves, like it has in fire investigation, DNA, bite mark analysis, or shaken baby syndrome, the system doesn't always follow. There are hundreds, possibly thousands, of people still behind bars today based on junk science. People like Anthony Kiles, convicted with unverified forensic testimony. Cameron Todd Willingham, executed in 2004 for arson that experts now believe was accidental. John Parks, who has served 30 Illipis years for a fire that new experts say wasn't arson. Justice isn't just about the courtroom. It's about staying current with truth. When we allow outdated methods to stand simply because that's how it was back then, we're not protecting justice, we're protecting mistakes. Life after exoneration. David Gavitt now lives free, but freedom isn't healing. He was released in his 50s, with no job, no money, no family left. The world had moved on without him. He didn't get to watch his daughters grow up. He missed every milestone, every moment. And worse, he spent 27 years grieving a family he loved while being accused of murdering them. There was no apology, no accountability from the state, just a thin compensation check and a quiet shrug from the system that stole his life. Yet David doesn't speak with bitterness. He speaks with resolve. Today, he advocates for forensic reform. He shares his story to raise awareness about wrongful convictions. And he fights for others like him, still waiting, still hoping, still suffering. When experts get it wrong, one of the most unsettling parts of David Gavitt's story is this: the people who testified against him weren't malicious. They weren't criminals. They were trained professionals, fire investigators, and forensic experts who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. And that's what makes cases like this even more terrifying. Because in court, expert testimony carries enormous weight. Jurors are more likely to trust someone with a badge, a title, or decades of experience. They assume scientific language means accuracy. But what happens when the science those experts rely on is flat out wrong? During David's trial, the fire marshal confidently described the so-called pour patterns, the broken glass, the high heat points, all as evidence of arson. He said these things with conviction. He stood on the witness stand and spoke as a man of science. But here's the catch: he had never run an experiment to validate those claims. In fact, the entire field of fire science at the time lacked rigorous peer-reviewed testing. Much of it was based on anecdotes, gut feelings, and untested assumptions passed down from one investigator to the next. We now know those indicators are unreliable, but back then, they were considered gospel. And David, he was convicted not because of malice, but because of misplaced trust in an outdated system. This highlights a major flaw in our justice process: expert testimony isn't infallible. And when it's based on unproven or obsolete science, it becomes dangerous, lethal even. That's why advocates today are calling for stronger scientific review panels, updated training for forensic professionals, and mandatory reviews of convictions tied to discredited techniques. Because if we want to prevent more David Gavitts, we must accept a hard truth. Justice built on bad science is no justice at all. David Gavitt's story is a haunting reminder: science isn't infallible, but when we base lives on science, it better be right. Junk forensics have destroyed lives. The legal system has too often turned a blind eye to evolving truth. And unless we confront that, we will continue to imprison the innocent while the real problems go unchecked. Because the question isn't just, how did this happen? The question is, how many more are still inside? Let David's story be more than a tragedy. It must be a wake-up call. If this case shook you, please like, share, and subscribe to stay informed on stories that matter. Comment below: do you think the justice system should automatically review convictions when science changes? Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and always question what's presented as fact claims.